It says this meeting is being live streamed.
Indeed. Ton, would you like to start the recording? And Ton, if you want to make the introductions.
Hello, everyone. This is Sephardic World. We bring you weekly meetings about Sephardic history and genealogy. We have been going at this for over a year now, and we have been quite successful. And today we have with us Ali Erginsoy, who has talked to us before, twice, in fact. And today he's going to tell us about the wonderful family Buzaglo. This family is all over the place. It's kind of a mini diaspora of its own. In one generation, they spread over 4 continents, and their stories are fascinating. I nearly forgot. As always, we thank our patrons who make all of this possible, and without them, we will be you would not be viewing us at this moment. Thank you, and Ali, you may begin.
Thank you very much, Ton. You can hear me okay?
Yes.
I can't see myself speak on the things, but anyway, it doesn't matter. First of all, I'd like to say Shana Tova, and wishing everybody a very happy and especially healthy new year from tomorrow. And I'll start my presentation now. So it's entitled Esther the Queen and the Brothers Buzaglo, and you'll see why in a minute. So when Esther Buzaglo received news in the autumn of 1761 of her husband's death, it came as a shock, but no great surprise. Joseph Buzaglo had cheated death more times than most mortals, but it had finally caught up with him on St. Eustatius, a volcanic lump in the middle of the Caribbean. A year earlier, Joseph had set off from London in search of his son Solomon, his only child from an earlier marriage, who had run away from home to enlist as a private soldier in the Dutch army. Esther, his new wife, he left in London in the care of 3 of his brothers. The Buzaglo family were, like Esther's, Moroccan Jews. The patriarch, Moses Buzaglo, was a distinguished rabbi in Mogador, and we think his wife's name was Esther. They had 5 sons, Joseph, Abraham, Shalom, and Jacob, and another brother, Isaac, who'd emigrated to Jerusalem and died there. The first 4 Buzaglo brothers had settled in England in the 1930s. Sorry, the 1730s, and were now plying their trade as merchants. After Joseph's departure on his quest to find his son Solomon, the brothers had mistreated Esther cruelly, and she missed her homeland, so she'd fled there to be with her people. It was here in Morocco that she learned the bad news. Esther's ancestors were among those Sephardic Jews who'd settled in Morocco after the expulsion from Spain in 1492. Her full name was Esther Reyna Bentubo. Esther Reyna, Esther the Queen in the dialect of her Castilian forebears. We think her parents were Abraham Levi Bentubo and Toyan Azagi, and that she had a brother, Moses. Esther had married Joseph 3 years previously in Morocco, and her marriage contract said that she was entitled to half her husband's assets if he died. Her family urged her to claim her inheritance, so Esther wrote to the brothers-in-law. They didn't reply. In frustration, she left Morocco and returned to London to confront them. Here she faced Shalom Buzaglo, the eldest of the brothers, 30-odd years her senior, a noted Kabbalist of his era and a Haham. This is his signature from a book he wrote about the Zohar. Shalom Buzaglo was not just a Haham, but also a Dayan, a religious judge who sat in judgment of matters like marital law, and a scholar of the Talmud, the book of Jewish laws. Shalom told Esther that according to Jewish law, she must now marry the eldest of her late husband's brothers, himself, who was conveniently widowed. The so-called levirate marriage, or yibum, he explained, was obligatory when a man died without a surviving child, unless both sides agreed to a ceremony that we see in this 18th century engraving, haliza, where the parties release each other from that obligation. But Shalom most certainly did not agree to haliza, and he argued, as Joseph had never found his son Solomon, who must be presumed dead, Esther had to marry him.
Sorry, we're not hearing the audio.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I'll read that. What Shalom did not tell Esther was that Solomon was indeed dead, but that he had survived his father only to expire himself shortly afterwards. This meant that Esther did not have to marry one of Joseph's brothers. In fact, she must not. According to the law, she was free to marry anyone she wanted as long as it was not one of the brothers. But if she did, her inheritance would go to another man, and that, as far as Shalom was concerned, meant it would be lost. But before we see if and how this problem was resolved, let's wind the clock back 30 years or so, when Joseph and his brothers first turned up in London. The great Jewish historian Cecil Roth wrote of Joseph Buzaglo, if in the annals of the 18th century there was any career more fantastic than his, it has escaped the notice of the present writer. Born in Marrakesh in 1701, Joseph Buzaglo arrived in London in around 1733 after the death of a first wife in Morocco. He set up as a merchant, and on 4th of March 1733, married Leah Shalom Moreno at Bevis Marks. But in December 1733, she too died, probably while giving birth to their son Solomon. Twice widowed and being of an adventurous nature, but possibly also because he was being chased by creditors, Joseph left his infant son in the care of Leah's sister, Elizabeth, who'd married Joseph's brother Jacob, and made his way to France. It was at this point that he added de Paz to his name, becoming Joseph Buzaglo de Paz. What happened is he seems to have turned the Shalom, Hebrew for peace, in his late wife's family name to the more Portuguese-sounding de Paz of the same meaning. It was an affectation, probably designed to make him out to be Portuguese. In the London Sephardic community and the wider Western Sephardic diaspora generally, Moroccan Jews were somewhat disparagingly referred to as forasteros, Portuguese for foreigners. In France, after making some extremely high-level contacts, Joseph seems to have got into serious trouble. The nature of this crime, if there was one, is unknown, but in around 1737, he was sent to the galleys under a lettre de cachet, an arbitrary judgment without appeal, sealed by the king. The use of galleys as vessels of war in France had ended some 20 years earlier, but convict rowers, or galériens as they were known, remained imprisoned on the hulks of galleys docked in Marseille, where they were branded with the letters GAL, eating, sleeping, and defecating while chained to their oars. In winter, they were transferred to work in the slightly better conditions of the arsenal seen here in the background. Joseph was released in around 1745 and deported to England. He was, however, determined to return, for he claimed to hate the British, against whom he nursed many grievances. What these were and why he didn't bear a grudge towards France, a country that had imprisoned him for the best part of a decade, is a mystery. In the meantime, Joseph discovered that in 1742, while a galérien, he had been declared a fugitive for debt in England. On his return to London, he surrendered himself to the keeper of the Poultry Compter, a small debtor's prison in the city's Cheapside that must have seemed like a hotel after the galleys. Here he took advantage of the latest Insolvency Act, one of the periodic amnesties that released debtors from their obligations, and was freed. Despite the expulsion order still in force, Joseph managed, by pulling some strings, to return to France. His pretext was a claim to have devised an incendiary projectile, something like a torpedo possibly, that could set enemy ships on fire, a weapon of obvious interest to the French in their never-ending maritime wars with Britain. The project had drawn the attention of a powerful figure, Louis-François de Bourbon, Prince de Conti, who was the king's cousin and a senior military commander. While exciting some initial interest, Joseph's pitch didn't get very far, but at least achieved the aim of allowing him to stay, which may well have been his intention in the first place. He continued to travel widely in France, especially between ports, but his movements eventually aroused suspicion. On 4th of December 1747, Joseph was arrested on suspicion of spying for England and thrown into the Bastille, the notorious prison fortress in Paris. Over 18 months later, most of which he spent in solitary confinement, Joseph was released on the 14th of August 1749 through the intervention of his patron, the Prince de Conti. On his return to England after his release, Joseph once again found that he'd been declared a fugitive debtor. And surrendering to the Poultry Compter prison again in September 1749, took advantage of an Insolvency Act to secure his release. This time he headed to Denmark, and a new chapter in an eventful life is a kind of trade emissary between the Danish crown and the Crown Prince of Morocco, Mohammed bin Abdullah, whom he'd known in his youth. Soon, Joseph and his brother Abraham were on a merchant vessel accompanied by 2 Danish frigates heading for the port of Safi on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. The head of the Danish mission was one Jean-Baptiste de Carrière de Longueville, who, despite his French-sounding name, was actually Danish. Foolishly, de Longueville decided once in Safi to turn the trading post that had been agreed into a military fort. Outraged at this violation of his father's sovereignty, Mohammed bin Abdullah revoked the trade agreement, destroyed the fort, and threw de Longueville into a dungeon. The 2 Buzaglo brothers, whose advice the Crown Prince blamed for this debacle, he condemned to death by burning. However, before carrying out this sentence, he sent an emissary, a Jewish merchant named Samuel Sumbal, to Denmark to explain his actions, as he was still keen to expand relations. Hoping to charm King Frederick V, he entrusted Sumbal with a letter that began, "God be praised for the creation of pens, which permit the communication of thought, even when owing to distance, communication by word is impossible." On his way to Copenhagen, possibly because he'd run out of money, Sumbal stopped off in Altona, a suburb of Hamburg, marked here in orange, to the left of the main city. Altona was then under Danish control and housed a large Jewish community, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic. In Altona, Sumbal was intercepted by Joseph's brother, the learned Haham, Shalom Buzaglo, who, having got wind of Sumbal's arrival, had traveled there from London to beg him to intercede with the King of Denmark on his brother's behalf. It was in Altona that Shalom found himself entangled in one of the most vicious rabbinic battles in modern Jewish history between 2 Ashkenazi rabbis, one his friend Jonathan Ebeschutz, the chief rabbi of the triple community of Hamburg, Altona, and Wandsbek, the other Jacob Emden, an enormously learned but pathologically quarrelsome scholar who had been passed up for the same position. Emden saw himself as a scourge of the Sabbatean heresy, the movement led by the false messiah Sabbatai Tzvi, who'd wreaked such havoc across the Jewish world in the previous century. Despite Tzvi's conversion to Islam in 1666 and his death in 1676, there were still secret adherents of his cult in various Jewish communities in Europe 100 years later, and Emden was convinced that Ebeschutz was one of them. His suspicions centered on a number of amulets Eberschutz had prepared some 20 years earlier when he was living in Metz, which Emden claimed contained secret references to Sabbatai Tzvi's messianic pretensions. This is a book that Emden wrote about the amulets and Eberschutz's connection to them. As Shalom Buzaglo was Eberschutz's friend, Emden suspected him of Sabbatean sympathies as well. True enough, both Buzaglo and Eberschutz were exponents of Kabbalah, the school of Jewish mysticism that sought secret meanings in the text of the Torah. Sabbatai Tzvi had also been a Kabbalist, so although not all Kabbalists were Sabbateans, it was enough, together with Shalom's friendship with Eberschutz, to tarnish Shalom Buzaglo in Emden's eyes. In a vicious pamphlet, Emden claimed that Eberschutz and Shalom had put on an orgy for Sumbal, lasting 2 nights and the intervening day, culminating in Eberschutz placing his beautiful daughter at Sumbal's disposal. This echoed an earlier claim in another pamphlet by Emden, who was determined to prove his adversary was a monster, that Eberschutz was in an incestuous relationship with his daughter and that she'd borne him a child. Emden later retracted this particular accusation, claiming, somewhat unconvincingly, that someone had tampered with a typeset of the pamphlet at the printers, which he owned, by the way. For Shalom Buzaglo, the Sabbatean controversy in Altona cannot have been more than an extremely unwelcome distraction from his purpose, which was to rescue his brothers from death by burning. After seeing Sumbal safely off to Copenhagen, he returned to London to await word of his brother's fate in Morocco. In the summer of 1752, the Sultan's emissary Sumbal sailed back from Copenhagen to Safi, where he managed to secure the release of the Danish envoy de Longueville. Although he was under instructions to also obtain pardons for Joseph and Abraham Buzaglo, the brothers were not released for another 5 years, in 1757. Their plight, however, does not appear to have been too perilous at this stage, as Muhammad bin Abdullah, by now Sultan, had taken to summoning them from their cell every evening in the manner of Scheherazade of the 1001 Nights to discuss European affairs. On his release, Joseph even became for a short time the Sultan's advisor on relations with France, whose ports and prisons he had such an intimate knowledge of. In around 1758, Joseph left Morocco, possibly surreptitiously, accompanied by his new wife, Esther Reyna Bentubo. Back in Copenhagen, Joseph dropped the Buzaglo in his name completely, styling himself simply Joseph de Paz, and attempted once more to persuade the French to let him back in. However, they refused, and swallowing his professed hatred for Britain, in 1759, Joseph made his way back to London. Despite having spent a large portion of the previous 20-odd years in various prisons, Joseph was a resourceful man and soon re-established himself as a successful merchant, even acquiring his own ships. One of these he named the Queen Esther, both a biblical reference and the name of his new wife. Before long, though, Joseph's final and fatal adventure would take him to St. Eustatius, a small Caribbean island in the Dutch West Indies. On his return to England, Joseph had learned that while he'd been languishing in a Moroccan dungeon, his only son, Solomon, had, in an act of teenage rebellion, a very rare thing within Sephardic families in those days, run away to Amsterdam in around 1752. Records of the Portuguese synagogue there show that on Adar Seni 5, 5513, or 11th of March, 1752, the synagogue authorities gave Solomon 3 guilders to leave the city for at least 5 years. In all likelihood, he'd become penniless, and the synagogue was trying to dispatch him back to London. But rather than return home, Solomon decided to enlist in a Dutch regiment and ended up being posted to various far-flung garrisons in the Dutch territories. 2 years later, the family received a contrite letter from Solomon, who begged them to purchase his discharge, as he feared the climate and unspecified enemies were going to kill him. Since then, nothing more had been heard of Solomon. Leaving behind his new wife, Esther, In around 1760, Joseph set out, perhaps even on the Queen Esther, to find Solomon. Eventually, his quest took him to St. Eustatius, a small but commercially significant Dutch possession in the Netherlands Antilles. The Dutch Republic was neutral in the 7 Years' War, in which the Caribbean was also a theater, and the Dutch had turned St. Eustatius into a free port without customs duties, so not much different from the tax havens that some of the neighboring islands are today. Countries like Britain, France, and Spain that were forbidden by law from dealing directly with each other shipped their produce to St. Eustatius, which became a transshipment hub for onward distribution to their final destinations in Europe and the Americas. Sephardic Jewish merchants played an important role in St. Eustatius's trade, capitalizing on their global network of family and co-religionist contacts. By 1750, 450 of the island's 802 non-enslaved inhabitants were Jews. Many were the descendants of refugees from New Netherlands, the northern corner of Brazil, which had been conquered by the Portuguese in 1654, prompting an exodus of Jews. Others were dispatchos from Amsterdam, lured by the promise of the riches offered by the trade passing through the island. By 1760, just before Joseph's arrival, between 1,800 and 2,700 ships were recorded as anchoring in St. Eustatius's port each year. It's quite possible that Joseph, having heard rumor of his son's whereabouts nearby, may have himself been carrying a cargo from Europe in his ship, mixing business with his personal mission. As the island with its volcano called the Quill hove into view, we can imagine that Joseph felt a shiver of excitement. He'd heard that his son might be nearby, maybe even on St. Eustatius itself, but the reunion was not meant to be. Having survived the galleys, the Bastille, a Moroccan dungeon under sentence of death by burning, and 3 marriages, Joseph died of an unknown cause on St. Eustatius. This is his headstone with a bizarre epitaph that seems appropriate to his very strange career. The Hebrew translates as, "And Joseph was 60 when he left for eternity on Sunday, 15 Iyar, 5521. His friends betrayed him when they saw that Joseph had become more famous than their forebears towards the end of his days. May his soul be bound up in the bonds of life." The English inscription reads, "Prosecuted all his days, envied to the grave, in spite of false friends, is praised by the brave. Joseph Buzaglo de Paz, aged 60 years, May the 15th, 1761. Apart from the mystery of who these treacherous friends were, Joseph's headstone raises some intriguing questions. Who paid for it to be engraved and laid, and when? My working theory is that it was his brother Abraham who either accompanied Joseph on his journey to St. Eustatius or went there shortly after his death. But where was the wayward son Solomon? Solomon really wasn't that far away. My research suggests he was, or at least had recently been, in what was then Dutch Guyana, today simply Guyana, at Fort Zeelandia, a military garrison on Fort Island on the Essequibo River. The headquarters of the regiment that was at Fort Zeelandia was based in Middelburg in the Dutch province of Zeeland, and most of the soldiers were actually Zeelanders. Here's a close-up from a map of the period showing the fort. And here are the ruins of the fort as they are today. So when had Solomon died? Our best guess is after his father's death in 1761, but sometime before 1763. The chronology becomes important for what happens in the next chapter of the saga. But before we deal with that, a diversionary postscript, the story of St. Eustatius. Had Joseph sailed the Queen Esther into the island's harbor 20 years later, on the 5th of February, 1781, he would have spied a piteous sight. A row of 101 Jewish men being herded into the weighing house, their women and children wailing loudly on the quay. Coming in, Joseph might have been lulled by the Dutch flag still flying over the fort, but maybe his suspicions would have been aroused by the presence of 15 British Navy frigates in and amongst the hundreds of vessels anchored off the port, flying the flags of various European nations. He would have soon realized that St. Eustatius was under British occupation, in revenge for the role of the island's merchants, Jewish and Dutch, in supplying the American revolutionaries with contraband arms and other supplies. St. Eustatius had been an irritant to King George III since 16 November 1776, when the American brig Andrea Doria, flying the newly adopted rebel colors of the Grand Union of the Republic, arrived in St. Eustatius's harbor and fired a cannon salute from its deck. The island's Dutch governor, Johannes de Graaf, had returned the gesture by way of a 9-cannon salute in welcome. This would come to be known as the First Salute, a historic moment when a European power first acknowledged the American colors. As the American Revolutionary War developed, the merchants of St. Eustatius and the other Dutch West Indies colonies continued the enormously profitable supply of contraband arms to the rebels. Eventually, the British declared war on the Netherlands, ordering Admiral Sir George Rodney to halt the supply of arms coming to the Americans through the Dutch colonies. Rodney had been knighted in 1764, but gambling habit, expensive tastes, and an unsuccessful run at Parliament had cleaned him out. The occupation of St. Eustatius was an opportunity to restore his fortune. Sorry, it's not behaving. What happens next is all too familiar in Jewish history. Pour encourager les autres, Rodney rounded up the entire Jewish male adult population of St. Eustatius. 31 heads of families were selected and told they would be exiled the next day, having to leave behind their families and all their possessions. All the hostages were stripped and the linings of their clothes ripped in search of valuables. Suspecting more money had been hidden, Rodney ordered his men to dig up the fresh graves in the Jewish cemetery to see if the caskets yielded more loot. The warehouses, shops, and homes of Jewish merchants were ransacked and the synagogue destroyed. The 31 men were shipped off to prisons on the island of St. Kitts, especially selected because, unlike its neighbor, Nevis, St. Kitts had only a small Jewish community and therefore less of a support network. Many perished. This was supposed to be a video as well, but I'm going to have to read this because you can't hear it. Remarkably, only one person is known to have died during the occupation, an old man from rough treatment at the hands of the British Marines. The Netflix version of the story would, of course, have Joseph Buzaglo as that man, struck down by Admiral Rodney himself after an anti-British tirade from Joseph, with his son Solomon, a prisoner in the Dutch garrison, looking on in despair. That is not, of course, how it ended for father and son Buzaglo 20 years earlier. Even though some of the exiles on St. Kitts managed to return, the thriving Jewish community of St. Eustatius never recovered, unlike Admiral Rodney's fortune, which grew fat on the plunder of St. Eustatius. And so back to our main story. Here is a power of attorney granted by Joseph Buzaglo in the Netherlands on the 1st of August, 1760, before he set off on his journey to find Solomon. I'm not sure why this isn't behaving, but the only remarkable thing about it is his signature at the bottom, which is as eccentric as he must have been in real life. Very elaborate, as you can see. Yet other documents showed that Joseph died a rich man. According to his executors, his assets included shares in the Fontaine de Paris, very large amounts due to him from the British government for the supply of ammunition, 41,000 florins due to him from the Danish crown, and 2 ships with cargoes valued at 90,000 florins. Joseph's Dutch estate came to £2,500. In addition, he also had a 3% annuity on £2,250 with the Bank of England. This was a legacy worth fighting over. As I mentioned at the beginning, Joseph's wife, Esther Reyna Bentubo, was entitled to half his estate under the terms of her Moroccan ketubah, and that made her very desirable indeed. And so we pick up Esther's story from where we left off, with Haham Shalom convincing her that she must marry him in a levirate marriage, or yibum. This they did sometime at the beginning of 1763, although there's no record showing where the marriage took place. At the same time, Shalom arranged for his daughter, Esther Rosa, to marry his brother, her uncle, Abraham, calculating that these arrangements were the best way to keep the lion's share of Joseph's legacies in his family. The only way the yibum would have been valid would be if Joseph had died childless. In this case, if Solomon had died before him. Even if we give Shalom the benefit of the doubt that he did not know at this stage that Joseph had predeceased Solomon, he also did not know that he hadn't. So the levirate marriage with Esther was a sham, and in the eyes of Jewish law, invalid. In fact, Shalom had been told by the Moroccan rabbinical court that he must not marry Esther, but had done so anyway. In a legal response to a question from the Amsterdam synagogue in connection with Esther's claim there, the rabbinical court in Tetuan would write in 1766, "The eldest brother-in-law, Shalom, set his eyes on her money and her person. He circumvented her and craftily beguiled her, alleging that it was for her benefit that he wanted to marry her, so that the other brothers should abandon all hope of getting the money. The poor woman was deceived and married him against Jewish law and to great scandal. Even though he was a scholar in a recognized position, he ignored our decision." Shunned by the London community, Shalom and Esther had to go to Amsterdam. Here they quarreled bitterly, and Esther once again returned to Morocco. Finally, in 1764, the Buzaglo brothers found proof that Joseph had predeceased his son. The Dutch trustees divided up most of the liquid assets between the various heirs, but refused to hand over the annuity, which they retained against any claim by Esther Bentubo, who, it turned out, was otherwise detained. On returning to Morocco, Esther had been imprisoned by the Sultan, possibly because of her former husband's antics in Morocco. Fortunately, the Dutch trustees were able to secure her release by sending a ransom of 200 pounds from the fund. Esther then traveled to The Hague, seen here in a print from the era, to pursue, with the help of her brother Moses, her case for her share of the annuity. Although Shalom Buzaglo and the other brothers launched legal actions in London to deny her claim, Esther had the upper hand and dug her heels in. Shalom was forced to travel to Holland, where they finally concluded a legally binding agreement on the 9th of December, 1767. Esther had won. Was that the end of the matter? Seemingly not, as the archives show Esther raising an action against the Buzaglo brothers as late as 1776, shortly before Shalom's death. Haham Shalom and his brothers had ruined her life. As a man, Shalom had survived the scandal, even receiving approbations from 2 rabbis in Amsterdam for a scholarly work in 1766. Esther, on the other hand, was a woman, and who would marry a widow with a sham marriage in her history? Maybe Esther was not too bothered by this. After all, she had money. Or maybe she adhered to the view, to paraphrase Gore Vidal, that as one gets older, litigation replaces relationships. 11 years later, on 20th September 1777, Shalom made his will, leaving the relatively paltry sum of £35 he'd accumulated in a patently unsuccessful career as a merchant to his various children. To Esther Reyna Bentubo, who he referred to by her maiden name, he left 5 shillings, a final insult to the woman who faced him down What Esther thought of this is unrecorded, as are so many of the thoughts and views of the women of the time. But what became of Esther Bentubo? Well, Tom Thielen has found out that Esther lived another 43 years, dying in 1820 at the age of 88 in The Hague. This is her headstone from a photo fortuitously taken by Tom in 2018. And here is her death certificate, dated the 21st of July, 1820. According to the death certificate, her last address was this cottage attached to the Sephardic cemetery in The Hague, probably renting a room from the caretaker. It may be that towards the end of her life, she'd become impoverished. Perhaps her handsome inheritance from Joseph Buzaglo had been dissipated on lawyers' fees. But she at least left some trace in history of her character and her determination not to fade away silently. Now to the story of the other Buzaglo brother of interest, Abraham. After his release from the Sultan's dungeon in 1757, Abraham returned to London and took up a new career as an inventor and entrepreneur. On 25th April 1765, he was granted a patent for a machine for warming rooms equally in every part and without offensive smell by means of a coal fire. In other words, a stove. Abraham enjoyed a brief period of success with his richly ornamented multi-tiered Buzaglo stove, as it came to be known, selling to grand houses and institutions, including Knowle Park in Kent, where it can be seen in its current sitting in the orangery in this picture. Another stove is known to have been ordered by Lord Botecourt, then governor of Virginia, as a present to the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg. But it was his next idea that was to take hold of the public imagination, though not perhaps quite in the way that Abraham had hoped. On 11th February 1779, he received a patent for machines, instruments, and necessaries for exercise, brackets, muscular strength and health restoring exercise, close brackets, which sounds a bit like a precursor to Pilates. In fact, he appears to have run an exercise class from a studio in the Strand in London. Abraham was convinced of the benefits of exercise in curing various ailments, but in particular gout, known as a rich man's malady because foods such as wine and red meat could lead to the buildup of uric acid crystals in the extremities and joints, causing excruciating pain. Abraham set up as a gout doctor, or quack would be more appropriate, introducing a stove into the treatment as well. The unusual cure seems to have attracted a fair degree of ridicule. This caricature, now in the collection of the British Museum, shows a trio of gout patients dancing a caprice de la goutte, or ballet arthritique, to the tune playing now. While in the background, Abraham tends to another pair of sufferers next to a Buzaglo stove. Another caricature, a detail from a larger print, shows Death dancing with a man who exclaims, "Buzaglo's exercise was nothing to this." Abraham does not seem to have taken the satire or the skepticism of the medical profession particularly well. In a pamphlet addressed to the public, he complains that no sooner did his discovery begin to acquire a reputation for the surprising cures it performed than it was attacked by the lowest and most contemptible of the faculty, men who are as great a disgrace to their profession as they are to society. They were men without genius, in the narrowest of the mold, declared enemies, etc., etc. Abraham Buzaglo completed his own Dance with Death in June 1788, at the age of 72. His will, unchanged from 25 years earlier, when he and his brother Shalom unsuccessfully conspired to deprive Esther Bentubo of her inheritance, left everything to his wife and niece, Esther Rosa. That's that.
Thank you. That was awesome. It was yeah. It's like a sort of Brazilian telenovela or Mexican telenovela. In fact, it was just really yeah. There's Ton, if it's okay. There's a couple of questions I'll go to first on YouTube. Nydia asks, is there any way to know who the other people on Saint Eustache were?
I don't know the answer to that. Tom might know, as it was a Dutch colony, whether there were any records of Jewish inhabitants of Saint Eustatius.
Ton, if you yeah.
Well, there's Isaac Emanuel, who wrote the history of the Jews in the Netherlands Antilles. He has a chapter on the other islands besides Curaçao, but those chapters are very small. There are not many archives left of St. Eustatius itself, but there could be something in the vast Dutch government archives. And it needs a bit of digging to find them. But there are no primary birth, marriage, death certificates from that period.
Okay, thank you. Yvonne, also on YouTube, is asking, is there a sort of complete report or story on the Buzaglo saga? I mean, I suppose we're waiting for you to write it.
Well, fortunately, there actually is. There are two, in fact. One is by Cecil Roth, who I referred to at the beginning, and that appeared in the Jewish Historical Studies, or rather, I think it was actually a lecture to the Jewish Historical Society of England. I forget the date, but many decades ago. And even earlier than that, another quite sort of confused, I think, article by Herbert Lowe, written in 1933. Now, obviously, both Lowe and Cecil Roth didn't have access to the internet. They didn't have the kind of resources we have today. So I've been able to fill in a few of the gaps in their knowledge and in the chronology of events. But it's easy to write a book about this, and who knows, one day maybe.
Yeah, I mean, so several people in the chat were saying that we should make a film of it or a play. It's absolutely fascinating. But Bernard, you have a question.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely gripping. Thank you so much. I loved it, and it leaves so many questions unanswered. But I have a question to ask. And that is, in 2 weeks' time, I'm doing a talk for the Jewish Genealogy Society. It's part 2 of a series called Sephardic Nordic Noir. And I am busy searching for relatives, because it's genealogical, from Scandinavia, of whom I've found many. At the moment, I have open in front of me the search pages from the Danish National Archives, and there's a lot of stuff on Buzaglo, but mostly not Danish. But I wondered whether you have any documentation or any sources on his life in Denmark. I mean, it seems to me that Denmark was just a convenience to him rather than in any way a place that he committed to. But I'm wondering whether there are traces, whether you know how he lived. We know that he took Esther there for a very short time. And I wondered whether or not you've got any sources that I might look at.
Unfortunately, I haven't really got any direct sources, any original sources. The information that I have is mostly from Cecil Roth's article, which is very good. But again, it doesn't go into huge detail about what happened in Denmark. But as you say, he appears to have gone there mainly as a vehicle for, drumming up business in Morocco. Yeah. But it all went horribly wrong, as it has so many times in his life, obviously. But so yeah, I mean, I don't think he had any particular attachment to Denmark. Okay. There is something that I saw the other day, and I didn't use this, but there's a mention of some links to the Buzaglo, one of the Buzaglo brothers, possibly Joseph, by somebody called Swedenborg, who was a Swedish diplomat and spy, apparently. And I don't know if you've ever come across him.
Yeah. Thank you. I will note that. Just so that you know, looking at the Danish archive that I've got open in front of me, it also refers to entries on him in the Encyclopedia Judaica. So if you're doing more research and haven't come across that, it may be useful.
Yes, thank you very much, Bernard. I did actually see the Encyclopedia Judaica entry, but it's not entirely accurate, actually. I think it's not entirely accurate.
No, but what is accurate? Have you found any?
I don't know. It's a lot of stuff doesn't chime.
Okay.
Right there.
Thank you.
No problem.
Tom, do we have other questions in Zoom?
Yes. About the Paz Moreno. What's the relation of Joseph Buzaglo with the Moreno family? And did the Moreno family name itself also the Paz?
I'm not sure that they named themselves the Paz, but basically Joseph's brother Jacob was married to Elizabeth Shalom Moreno. And so, she was his sister-in-law. Her mother, or possibly aunt, left a legacy to her great nephew, Solomon Buzaglo, who, the wayward child who ran away to join the Dutch army, of around £40 when she died, quite early on, like 1741 or something like that. But he doesn't seem to have been aware of this legacy because, he wrote a begging letter asking for his family to pay for the discharge from the army. But if he'd known about this legacy or had possession of this legacy, he would have been able to buy himself out, because £40 was a reasonable sum in those days. But she is mentioned in an article, I think again in the JHSE journal by Miriam Rodriguez Pereira, who discovered some very interesting papers about this grand lady who left various bequests, including to Solomon. But it's quite interesting because there's a very detailed description of her possessions, and so it gave an idea of how a woman in her position, a Sephardic lady in that position, would have lived in those days. But that's worth seeking out. Whether they call themselves the Paz as well or not, I'm not sure. I'd have to look that up. Check against the Bevis Marks records.
Judith Cohen invited Buzaglo from Morocco originally to attend, and he actually is a filmmaker. So maybe we can persuade him to do something on his family.
Fantastic. That would be great.
But I don't see his name among our attendants, so he will watch it later and react maybe.
Do we know anything more about Esther other than the court cases? I mean, do we know, for example, what languages she spoke, or how she lived?
My guess is that she spoke Arabic, and maybe a smattering of Spanish. But she was a bit of a fish out of water in London, for sure.
Yeah.
She just comes across as a very stubborn lady.
Mhm.
She really kept pursuing this for a very, very long time. She didn't give up. And I think she might have had support from her brother Moses. But that's very brave in those days, and especially to take on somebody of the stature of Shalom Buzaglo, who a Dayan, a Kabbalist. He was a big cheese. So I think I have very positive impressions of her character.
Anna's asking if she could read. I mean, are there any documents, for example, signed by her? I mean, that would be, I suppose, about writing, but
I've not seen any.
Yeah. So
well,
yes, more encouragement on YouTube to write a book.
you must write an article and a script for a film then.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Yes, the Netflix version, we can set it 20 years later with the destruction of Saint Eustatius.
Yeah.
So, Ton, shall we? Bruce is asking if you can say any more about the American Revolution intersections.
Yeah, I mean, that was a little bit of a sort of what's the word? A diversion. But I don't really know a lot more about it than that. I mean, I think it was a fairly important event at the time in propaganda terms for the nascent American revolutionaries, because it was literally the first time that a European power, and Netherlands was a very significant European power, had recognized them. The governor who ordered the salute got into a bit of trouble because of this. He was because it was against his government's policy, actually, because they wanted to remain neutral. So he was recalled to Holland, but only received a sort of slap on the wrist and was sent back to St. Eustatius. So it can't have been too serious, but then they still ended up with the British declaring war on the Netherlands and sacking St. Eustatius. So that's all I can tell you that I know, really.
Thank you.
One more little fact. In fact, the Dutch were not the first to recognize the United States as a alleged country. It was Morocco that did that in 1777.
This is true, except I did say European.
Yes.
This is true, and it was the same Sultan, Mohammed bin Abdullah, who seems to have been, I mean, apart from his rather unfortunate habit of throwing people in dungeons and sentencing them to death by burning, seems to have been, very open to building links with the West. He wrote to the King of Denmark. He wrote to Washington, George Washington, who ignored him for a few months, and but then sort of changed his mind and obviously thought this was not a bad idea. So yeah, and he was obviously very interested in European affairs. He was calling Joseph up from his dungeon every night to tell him about stuff, and yeah. An interesting character, I think.
Yeah.
Possibly a final question, but a great final question from Nydia on YouTube. What can we learn from the brothers' lives? I mean, for those of us around today, what moral lesson do you think we can take away from this?
Family, eh? Yeah, I think maybe one lesson you can take away from it is that, you know, even in closest families, people are willing to screw each other over.
Yes.
And it's not a new phenomenon. It seemed to happen way back then. It looks like Shalom and Abraham had sort of entered a pact to sort of get Esther's money for themselves. But what happened to Jacob, you know, the other brother, and what happened to Isaac's children back in Jerusalem? You know, they got frozen out probably, although they didn't get her money in the end. But it just seems a bit sort of sad in that way. The other thing, of course, is that, you know, again, I'm just struck by how incredibly mobile Sephardic Jews were in that era. I mean, you know, Joseph traveled from Morocco to London, back to Morocco, to France, to Copenhagen, to St. Eustatius, who knows where else. You know, he was constantly on the move. And they all seem to have been, you know, Shalom was going back and forth as well. So this was not an easy undertaking in those days. It's just amazing how incredibly mobile they were.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Frances, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm unmuted, aren't I?
You are.
It fascinates me, this travel business, because my Sephardi relatives traveled like lunatics. And that was in the, you know, from the 1920s onwards. They traveled like nutcases. My mother had Sephardi parents. My father was Ashkenazi, but I grew up with the Sephardim. And they were mad. My grandfather prayed all day. My grandmother had affairs in Europe. I know. They were a wild bunch. And they seemed to be liberated from the notion of always running away. That's what it looks like to me, comparing it, because of the different ways that the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim lived, because of going into Europe and living in villages. Does this mean anything? That the Sephardim stayed in these apparently quite fluid communities, but held together and shot off all over the world, sometimes persecuted. Is that the way it was?
I'm not probably the best person to answer that. I don't know, David.
Have a go. Try.
Yeah, there might be something in that. I mean, I think because, you know, I suppose because a lot of them came from originally their ancestors, and not too distant ancestors, came from Portugal, and then went to Amsterdam or Bayonne or London or wherever. You know, another move after that wasn't particularly staggering. I mean, in my own life, I've kind of moved around 6 times in my life,
Right.
in 6 different countries, and I don't feel, you know, I belong to any of them. I've been in the United Kingdom for, you know, nearly 40 years now, but you know, I wouldn't say that I belong here. You know, I could go anywhere, and I suspect there's a little bit of that as well. You know, the cosmopolitan globalists.
Yes, if you look at David Olusoga's program about the slave trade, that a lot of Sephardim were transporting, though not literally selling, the slaves over to Latin America. But there were also people living there. They all got married in the end, apparently. The slaves were liberated. Everybody married them, including the Sephardim. It's a very fluid history, which goes right against the dominant attempt to stop it from being fluid fascinates me.
Yeah.
Delights me.
What amazes me is that there are so many documents to be found all over the world
Yes.
with regard to this family. And I think we haven't seen everything yet. So there must be a lot left to research, not only for the Buzaglos, but for other families as well. And Francis is right, the Sephardim were very mobile.
Yes.
Bernard raises his hand.
Is he? Don't think so.
No?
No, no,
Oh,
no. Shall we wind up? Doc?
yes.
Bernard, yes, he's done it. He's raised it.
Okay.
Oh.
You sure? I can't see.
I can see his hand waving.
Okay.
Maybe on-
Bernard, if
It said the host is not allowing participants to unmute themselves. Just a quickie, since I've been sitting here looking at these pages from the Danish National Library, both the Buzaglos and the Bentubos have an amazing set of descendants with really important histories in medicine, veterinary medicine, science, and invention. And it looks like all of the bits that seemed to be a joke in that story have become serious professions in which they've made major contributions. So, you know, anybody who's thinking of doing a follow-up or possibly doing something set in the present that then jumps into the past would have a field day.
That's very interesting, actually. Yes.
Yes.
From gout doctor to proper doctor, and yeah.
No, and really important contributions in medicine and veterinary medicine and in invention of machinery. So they're an interesting family all round, or a set of families all round.
Yeah.
I think there is theatre. I mean, I'm a theatre maker. I do mostly political. I don't do West End. I left it a long time ago. But there is, I think, a theatre around this, which is absolutely stunning. If one could bring some of this stuff together, having been to the other sessions, these threads are electric, quite electric, and this particular family is. My God, they were so awful and so brilliant and so resourceful.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
So, shall we wrap up, David?
yeah. Do you want to announce our speaker next week?
Yes. First of all, I want to thank Ali for a brilliant talk. It's very riveting and very interesting. I want to thank our viewers on Zoom, our patrons, in fact, who support us and make all of this possible. And thank you to our viewers on YouTube. Next week, we will have Jonathan Schors, and he will talk about a failed colonial experiment of the Dutch in Guyana, involving a few Dutch Sephardim. And I hope to see you all next week.
So it's just for us to wish everybody Chag Sameach, Shana Tova, many years, as we say in London, Boas Entradas, as we're starting to say again, because we're, I don't know, just silly. Muchos años, Bob has written. So we wish everybody a wonderful time over Rosh Hashanah, and we thank Ali very much. That was absolutely spectacularly entertaining and interesting talk. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next week. So many thanks and goodbye.